I'm delighted that you could join us today. Today is going to be a very, very interesting and useful discussion. We have special guests today that are, I think, the A-team in teaching and thinking about what are best practices in teaching about climate in your classroom. We have two folks, Lynn Andrews and Cari Herndon, from the National Center for Science Education, an amazing organization that helps us get best practices in science in schools. To give you a little bit about their bios, Lynn Andrews is the Director of Teacher Support at NCSE. She joined them in 2019 after teaching biology for 18 years. Lynn joined the NCSC team and has had the opportunity to help drive a solid science foundation for students all over the nation, and the project gives her the chance to help teachers navigate the often turbulent waters of overcoming misconceptions in biology and climate science. And also with us today is the curriculum specialist from NCSE. Cari joined the organization in 2021 after teaching middle school science for 9 years. She has a master's degree in secondary education from DePaul University and is passionate about creating inclusive science curricula. As part of the supporting teachers team, Cari designs curricula aligned with the next generation science standards that provide teachers with the tools to help students overcome misconceptions about climate change and evolution. And we're delighted to have both of you with us. I have been following NCSE and its work for many years, and have found the resources that you put together to be very, very useful. And I'm now really excited that there's a crew that is really dedicated to supporting teachers, as you are. And we're really grateful that you're coming on with us today to discuss the resources that you've been putting together about teaching about climate and a little bit of the mindset that comes with. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
We're very excited to be here. I'm going to share screen real quick, and then I'm going to let Cari get us started. All right. Can everybody see the screen okay?
We do.
Awesome. Excellent.
And hopefully everyone can hear me on top of being able to see our shared screen. I just want to first of all say thank you to John Muir Laws for inviting Lynn and I to speak today. We really appreciate the opportunity to show the fruit of our labor, and we're sincerely hoping that everyone here sees something that they feel that they can take back to their class, and that they can utilize to increase their students' climate literacy, meaning better understand climate, its causes, its impacts, and its importance. Again, my name is Cari Herndon, and let's get started. Next slide, please. Like I said, my name is Cari Herndon, and as John said, I was hired on in late 2021 to support the curriculum writing process and provide insight into climate change education and the next generation science standards. I'm certified to teach high school biology and all the middle grade sciences, and I taught middle school science for 9 years, of which climate science was a standard part. In the last few years of my teaching career, I also became involved in climate justice education. Dr. Dee Dee Wright is our Assistant Director of Teacher Support, and she recently completed her doctoral studies in ecology with a human environment specialization at Colorado State University. Prior to that, she spent 25 years both teaching science and supporting other science teachers, first as a science teacher herself, then as a curriculum coordinator. Dr. Blake Touchette has taught middle school and high school science, including both biology and environmental science, and served as a master teacher for his school district. He recently completed his doctorate at the University of Louisiana in Lafayette, and his research centered on understanding administrator knowledge and acceptance of evolution. Heather Grimes is our program coordinator, and she is the literal glue that holds us together. She fills in a variety of roles, including data analysis, budgeting, and outreach. And finally, Lynn Andrews is our director of teacher support. Lynn's been with NCSE for 2 years after an 18-year career teaching high school biology. Under her direction, the supporting teachers program at NCSE has thrived, and this is one of 3 lesson sets, what we're going to be sharing with you today, that are being released as a part of her vision. So without further ado, to give you some background into the why of what we hope to achieve with our curriculum, I'm going to turn it over to Lynn.
Thank you, Cari. She does such a good job of introducing me that I love it when she does it. She's much more eloquent about it than I am. So as Cari mentioned, I was a classroom teacher for many, many years. I also worked in a private school, both public and private. So when I say 18 years, it was split. And I think that you learn a lot more about education when you've actually been in both places, public and private. And that brought a lot of opportunity for me. Another thing that I like to mention when I do talk with people is that I was born and raised in Tennessee, and then my whole career was in Kansas. So I have actually lived and worked in the Midwest and the South my entire career. So I was really excited that a California-based group took a chance on me, coming from more of a heartland position, more of the Midwest area. And so that was really exciting that they took that risk, and I think it's paid off for both of us. So I did want to kind of outline a little bit about who NCSE is, because some of you may never have heard of us. We have been around for 40 years. We're celebrating our 40th anniversary this year. So the National Center for Science Education originally began with the branch that we call Catalyzing Action, which is where our goal is to make sure that science stays science in the classroom. And that can be very, there's a lot of different facets to what that looks like, but we are really just trying to make sure that when there are science standards, that they are upheld and supported. And then the second 2 branches, one is my branch, the supporting teachers branch. As mentioned, it started in about 2017, 2018, and I took over it in 2019. And then our most recent is we're actually starting to do science education research, where we're looking to see what is happening in science ed right now and how can we help. So that's a whole new area that we're focusing on as we move forward. We have lots of great research being worked on at this time. So if you're interested in any kind of data or research tied to what we do, please investigate our website. So I want to talk more specifically about us and like why we came up with the lessons we did. And the most important thing that I can share with you guys is that we talk about misconceptions a lot during this presentation, but we are speaking to you as teachers. When we talk to our students, we don't really discuss the misconceptions, we discuss evidence. So whenever I talk about misconception-based learning, we're putting that in the context of how can you approach this with your own kids? But it's really important that you don't lead with misconceptions, because that can actually stick better than evidence. And so just a kind of a little cautionary tale there before we move forward. But when you look at the research, and this is from a study in 2014, John Cook is one of our mentors, and he is a really amazing man from Australia who had worked at George Mason for quite a long time in their Climate Change Communication Center, and all of his research theses and everything else tied to his work has always been about how do you communicate with people about science that is often societally controversial. And so he's recently moved back to Melbourne, but he continues to partner with us in this endeavor. And one of the papers he published or used in his research was a Hayhoe paper, Catherine Hayhoe's out of Texas, where they looked at giving pre-test and post-test to students And looking when you do traditional learning, and what we mean by traditional learning is lecture and textbook work, possibly worksheets, labs, that kind of things, just that traditional learning in the format we've seen and probably been taught most of our lives. The gains were not as great as when you actually focused on the evidence and breaking down those misconceptions through evidence. And so that's just one excerpt of data. We have more. Another one that recently came out was by SBU and the Society for the Study of Evolution. And RH Neem has done a lot of work in this area of like what really works and helping kids break down those concerns and misconceptions they may have about these science topics. And his focus was evolution, but it applies across all societally controversial topics. And the main image I really want you to focus on is the bottom right. And I know it can be small, and I apologize for that. We try to get all the data on there. It made it challenging. But if you'll just notice that the blue line is where you combine two really powerful pedagogical skills, active learning and misconception time. And you can see that the gains were fairly significant. And the blue line is the one you follow all the way across each of the data sets. And they ran a series of tests. When you see this stuff that says SINs and acorns and all that kind of stuff, those are just different science evaluation tools that are used by college researchers to decide what do they know going into the material and what do they know coming out of the material. So I don't want you getting bogged down in all the research part of this. The big thing I want you to take away is that active learning is what we define as using inquiry, evidence, having students follow a phenomenon, which is a lot of language that you'll see tied to next generation science standards. And so that's how we base that research, is that there is a need for this kind of change. Then the other thing that we wanted to kind of just touch on is that when we talk about, well, why misconceptions anyway? Misconceptions can have a variety of influences on learning, and we're all guilty of it. There's no one that comes into a classroom without some preconceived notions, not even the teacher. And so I think that's really important that we acknowledge that it's not just students with misconceptions, it's often us. I still am learning every day, and I open myself up to the fact that I'm often wrong. But when we are unknowingly wrong, it can actually impede our ability to understand when we're presented with information that has data to support it. So sometimes they just don't know their knowledge base is not correct, and it's no fault to anyone. Another thing that can happen is that we often have this previous knowledge base, and it can actually make us resistant to learning new ideas. And I find that I still struggle with that in my own ways, because I feel very confident in what I know. And then when I'm presented with something that doesn't necessarily agree with that set of knowledge, it can be very hard to embrace those new ideas. But the best part about science is nothing in science ever stays the same. And so we have to really learn to adapt to that mentality. And so it's not a skill that we're born with. We definitely have to hone. The other two are a little bit more tricky. When we talk about entrenchment, what we mean by that is if you base all of your knowledge on past knowledge, and especially if it's erroneous, it can really make it difficult for students to grasp new material. I have many examples of that I've had from my students. Some are kind of comical and some are not as comical, but the reality is kids come in with some really strange ideas. And it can be very hard when those ideas have been reinforced in a lot of different ways, especially through social media, that entrenchment becomes greater. And then finally, ontological beliefs do play a role in how well students are open to learning new knowledge. And so talking about the science realm and the nature of science versus other ways of knowing can be very difficult for science teachers to navigate. So with that being said, I wanted to kind of show you the method we use on how we do it. So this comes out of more of John Cook's work, and the debunking handbook is a handbook that is readily available to anyone that's interested. If you just type in debunking handbook to Google, you'll pop it right up. And the thing that is important to understand about how we debunk misconceptions is you lead with the facts, because misconceptions, I mentioned earlier, are stickier. And when you have the sticky ideas that really are pervasive across the topic, like climate change is a natural cycle, and I'll have a slide that reflects that in a second. It's very hard to replace that sticky myth with those facts. So they have to be extremely specific, and they have to be very purposeful. So you want to show evidence, and you want to focus on evidence. That should be the main conversation throughout the entire endeavor. And then you only mention the myth in passing after you've gone through all of the curriculum. And you also make sure that you explain, when you mention the myth, you put it in the context of not that people are wrong, but where do we think the misunderstandings come from? So you're not trying to put a negative connotation onto the misconception. You're trying to get them to become more able to see misconceptions when they are presented to them, because most often they're going to get that through YouTube and their various social media networks. And so you want them to be able to be prepared for more misinformation coming in. So you want to talk with them about, how do you identify misconceptions? How do you know when something's coming in as non-factual and more opinion-based? And that's where the FLICK method comes into play. So FLICK is just a fun acronym that John Cook put together with the help of some other researchers, where they look at, there are different categories of ways misconceptions penetrate our world. And so you have fake experts, you have logical fallacies, impossible expectations, cherry picking, and conspiracy theories. And if you guys want to know more about that, I would suggest going to skepticalscience.com, or we are always willing to come back and just have a whole session on FLICK with you guys, because it's a very interesting subject. But we really want to talk about climate with you guys today. And I just wanted you to have some of the setup of how we do things. So kind of transitioning that to an example, one misconception that is commonly brought up to us by our teachers. And I should preface, before we move forward just a little bit more, that all of our work is done by teachers and for teachers. And so Cari and I are both teachers from our past. And then we also have a staff, not a staff, but we have a group of volunteer teachers that work with us to develop all of our lessons. And so when we sat down with them and said, hey, what do you need? That was our very first conversation. And I said, tell us the things that you're encountering in your classrooms. And one that comes up quite often is that climate change is just natural always, that it is just, we're seeing another cycle of a pattern that has been pervasive throughout all of historical time. And there is truth that there are natural cycles in climate, but we're using a fallacy called jumping to conclusions, because the fact is that even though there are natural cycles in climate, what we're currently seeing is not following that natural pattern if you look at the trends over time. And we have actually an entire lesson dedicated to kind of helping with this misconception. And so John Cook is also a cartoonist, so he always likes to do really funny cartoons to go with his work. And so if you find that cartoon funny, he has a whole passel of them that you could go check out. And I think that's neat too, because a lot of you are here because you love art, and he is also an artist in his work. He does all of his own art, very similar to Jack. So, all right, with that, I'm going to hand this over to Cari to tell you about each of our lessons, and then I will jump back in towards the end. So Cari, off to you.
Thanks, Lynn. So like Lynn shared with us, the NCSE curriculum lesson sets are written for student-centered learning by our experienced team of teacher ambassadors. And the point of them is to directly address student misconceptions. Each lesson set, grounded in a next generation's science standard storyline design, centers on the investigation of a high interest phenomena through inquiry-driven activities using open source resources. Not only are the lessons free to use and highly adaptable, but they utilize materials that you may already have or are easy to find. Each lesson set has 5 to 7 activities, each with objectives and outcomes that allow students to explore the sticky science that discredits a misconception. The lesson sets can be used all together as a whole, or you can pick and choose what lesson sets you need to supplement the curriculum you already have in your classroom based on your students' needs. So for example, if you have some students who are expressing some misconceptions about climate models and how reliable they are, then you could use our climate modeling lesson set to supplement what you already do in the classroom. If you have some students who have questions about how extreme weather is impacted by climate change, then again, you could take our lesson set about extreme weather and you could supplement your curriculum with that lesson set. So you can use them all together or pick and choose what's necessary. Next slide, please. So jumping right into it, let's go ahead and look at each of the lesson sets. And what I'm going to do is sort of give an overview of the lesson sets and then highlight one of the activities from the lesson set. So lesson set number 1 is called Scientific Consensus, a Tsunami of Evidence. And as the name suggests, this lesson set focuses on the plethora of scientific evidence available that supports the idea that climate is changing. Students are provided with numerous examples to explore modern day climate change and determine whether or not it directly results from human influence, i.e. it's anthropogenic. And yes, students do come to the conclusion that it is anthropogenic. Students investigate the phenomena of a bad science gone viral. That's their starting point. And then they investigate what makes good science, including concepts such as scientific consensus, outliers, and peer review. Students then apply those concepts of the viral misconception, which is centered on eating chocolate to lose weight, to methods that are used to build a false case against climate change. Along the way, students build their understanding of feedback loops in a climate system, and they analyze real-world data to justify whether or not the climate is changing as a result of anthropogenic activity. And again, based on real-world data, they come to the conclusion that it is. The highlighted activity from this lesson set is called Experts Agree. This is one activity that I love because students are actually practicing that flick method that Lynn told us about. Students analyze research completed by John Cook, and they determine if science have reached scientific consensus in regard to anthropogenic climate change. So they're looking at real data. This is not a made up simulation. This is real data that they're investigating. They then analyze the Global Warming Petition Project, which, if you're not familiar, began in 1998. And they have to explain why this project is an effective piece of misinformation and compare and contrast it to their anchoring phenomena, which is that chocolate diet meant to help people lose weight. Then they justify which aspect of Flick is being used to discredit climate change. There are several misconceptions that are utilized in this lesson set. And again, like I said, our lesson sets are not one and done, right? So the lesson that I just highlighted is actually the culminating lesson. Students build their knowledge of relevant facts to discredit the misconceptions. And then this highlighted activity is actually giving them the opportunity to directly address misconception number 1 and number 2. So they're building towards this and they practice this skill and then they actually apply it to climate change. Misconception number 3 is is directly addressed in the activity that succeeds this one. So it's multiple activities. They practice these skills, and then they have 2 culminating activities to actually apply to these misconceptions. The second lesson set is called Understanding Climate Models. And this lesson set uses the evolution of video game graphics meant to represent real world sports such as football as an analogy for the evolution of climate modeling and forecasting, which is also meant to represent real world conditions of our climate system. So again, we have this phenomena that the students are investigating, and in this case, it happens to be video games. And the students look at the development of video games and they identified the different parameters that must be included in order to make a realistic model. They specifically look at football video games and they think about how these video games have changed over time, and they have to identify different factors that are included. So for example, in the beginning, maybe all that's really included is some basic physics and graphics. But then as you watch the video games evolve, you see that they're including the individual personalities of the players, right? So the graphics are becoming more realistic, and it's meant to model those realistic conditions. Once they do that, students develop a better understanding of climate versus weather language, and they complete their own climate projections based on different data sets and analyze climate models projections. Finally, students compare the hindcast parameters and forecasts of different climate models over time in order to justify whether or not climate models can be trusted. The highlighted activity here is our future climate scenarios. This particular lesson includes an applet that was created in partnership with the King Center for Visualization in Science. Students use the applet to better understand 4 different climate models that have been used by scientists, policymakers, and politicians to project potential future climates. They start by analyzing the hindcast of these models. And a hindcast is really just comparing what your model would have said about events that have already happened in order to see how accurate it would have been. Then they look at the parameters of the model. So they identify what factors are being included in each of the models. And then they use the University of California Museum of Paleontology's Understanding Global Change. They have a wonderful applet as well. And they create a concept map-like representation of the real world system being modeled. This sounds super complicated, but it's really actually fun, and students really enjoy creating these concept maps. It's very interactive. Finally, the students compare the projections to the measured occurrences, and they're able to justify whether or not climate models and projections are reliable. So it's a very involved kind of lesson, and it's definitely something that takes multiple steps, but the outcome is really wonderful. Misconception number 1 is addressed really early on in this unit because we find that students and people in general tend to use weather and climate interchangeably. So we want to make sure that we're building that scientific vocabulary so that students can use it effectively. And in addition to that, students have a variety of creative opportunities in order to demonstrate their understanding between these different words. The culminating activity that I just highlighted provides students with the opportunity to address the misconceptions number 2 and 3. But again, just like in lesson set number 1, students are building to this. So they're looking at other climate models, including some almanacs, in order to practice the skill of analyzation for when they see these scientific models. Lesson set number 3 is called Back to the Future Climate Edition, and it provides students with an opportunity to see how scientists use climate proxies to build a model of past climate. A climate proxy is something that's used in place of actual climate data for periods of time when we could not actually gather that data. They're introduced to a variety of proxies, including fossils, tree rings, and ice cores. And they use that to build a picture of what past climate looked like. They synthesize information from a variety of sources to create a claim that current weather patterns are not natural, unlike past climate. And students also then research what future climate will be like unless actions taken to change our impact. The activity I'd like to highlight for you is called Looking at Layers, and it's actually a multi-activity lesson. So students do there's three parts to this lesson. And in the first lesson, students use a program called ImageJ to analyze tree rings. And this is a lesson that we adapted with the permission of Dr. Nikki Dobby, who is a paleoclimatologist. The students create a reconstruction of recent climate history using tree rings, and then they compare it to measured occurrences to build evidence for the reliability of the proxy. Students later use a model ice core adapted with the permission of Louise Huffman, who's the Director of Education and Outreach at the U.S. Ice Drilling Program, to better understand the importance of glaciers to the study of past climate. And then finally, they compare and contrast the rate of current climate change to past climate change using another King Center applet. Students are then able to justify that although the climate has been warmer in the past, the rate of change is unprecedented. And something that I really like about this lesson set is very early on in the lesson set, they learn about how volcanoes can influence climate. And then they actually look at the tree ring data to identify if they can see a cooling period due to volcanic activity that they studied. And it lines up perfectly. It's really beautiful. The misconceptions that are addressed here, misconception number one being a logical fallacy, and misconception number two, the idea that what we're experiencing today is not as bad as what's happened previously. They're addressed repeatedly throughout this unit. So again, this is not just a one and done kind of thing. They're repeatedly exposed to the idea that what we're seeing today is much more extreme rate and cause of climate change unlike anything Earth has experienced in the past. So they use these proxies to look at the rate of change, and they can see that it's very different today than what the rate of change has been in the past. Lesson set number 4, climate change in your own backyard. This is our extreme weather lesson set, and they start with a view from 10,000 feet. They examine how climate change is generally impacting extreme weather using a dice rolling activity with an ever increasing number of loaded dice. Students then make observations and ask questions about a series of NOAA maps that depict billion-dollar extreme weather events in the United States over multiple years. Students compare and contrast their findings with NOAA data on extreme weather, and they make a claim that describes the frequency of these events over time. And we have updated this with the most recent data from 2021. Students then focus in further on their region, and they complete an activity that's centered on an impact that they might already be experiencing, such as hurricanes or wildfires or precipitation. Finally, they compare and contrast warming patterns in rural and urban areas, which is meant to debunk the misconception that urban heat islands are what's causing global warming. And then they apply what they learn about heat waves to complete an engineering design challenge that explores techniques to cool an urban heat island. So the lesson that I'm going to highlight for you is called Focusing In on Your Region. This activity or this lesson I really love because it provides a wide variety of opportunities for teachers to engage with their students. And it brings that closer to home, right? Looking at climate models, looking at past climate is not necessarily going to resonate with all students. But this, again, is an opportunity to make it relevant to what students are experiencing right here, right now. It's an ever-growing group of resources that teachers can choose from. Right now, the resources include determining hurricane frequency, evaluating wildfire causes, modeling climate change's impacts on droughts, analyzing trends in tornadic storms, among others. And I'm certain that we've all been keeping up with what's going on with the drought in the West. And Lynn, just had a tornado in her area. So we're all experiencing these things right now. And we're currently exploring different ways to organize these place-based climate activities in order to help teachers find the resource that they need. But right now they're kind of organized by type of impact. So again, this can be done in a variety of ways. Teachers can choose an impact and allow all students to explore the same one, or teachers can do I like to call it voting by foot, where students have stations set up and they can choose what they want to investigate, or they can go by region, right, where the teacher assigns based on strengths of the students and what skills students might need more practice on. Some are literacy based, some are mathematics based. So there's a wide variety of access points as well. And again, this is a great lesson with a variety of ways to engage with students. There are two misconceptions that are addressed in this unit. Number one is continually addressed, but applied to the extreme weather that students are currently experiencing or will experience in this particular activity. And misconception two is directly addressed in the activity that succeeds the one in which students learn about heat waves. They compare and contrast temperature trends in a rural area and a nearby urban area in order to provide evidence to the fact that the increase in urban areas is not causing the trend of global warming, and that rural and urban areas are actually experiencing the same type of warming trend. So this misconception that the fact that there are more urban areas today than there were in the past is what's causing it to appear like there's global warming when we look at global temperatures. That's what's being directly addressed here. Lesson set number 5. So this is our culminating lesson set. And it's meant to help students redefine their role as scientists and as climate contributors, as well as redefining what a climate change hero is. Students start by writing their science autobiography, and they engage in collecting data about the organisms that live near their school or home, and brainstorm how this type of survey work might help scientists understand the impacts of climate change. This is a great opportunity for some of that science journaling that I know all of you really enjoy doing, right? Getting students out and doing some of that journaling, but then also doing some survey work using some of the crowdsourced apps that are available. Students then analyze scientific papers to better understand how that crowdsourced data has contributed to the study of climate change and its impact on living organisms. And then they investigate what must be done to mitigate climate change using a King Center for Visualization in Science applet called Design Our Climate Simulation. After students do all of this work, they come back to their science autobiography that they wrote in the first place in order to address some of the heroic actions that they can take now and in the future, and realize that real climate change heroes don't wear capes, but lab coats. The activity that I'd like to highlight for you is one of 2 culminating activities. So teachers can choose to use one of these activities or both of them. Students use what they've learned in this lesson set and in previous lesson sets to create a comic strip that depicts 2 futures. One in which climate crisis is not addressed, and the second in which carbon emissions are decreased and carbon sequestering action has taken place. Prior to this activity, students have researched these solutions using the Project Drawdown website, and students provide evidence for both of these futures. The other opportunity teachers have here is to participate in one of our ever-growing bank of location-based community service projects or climate activism opportunities. Teachers after this activity are also encouraged to give students time to reflect on meaningful steps they're willing to take. And there's a thinking routine provided to help give structure to this classroom discussion. And I want to be really clear that it's really geared towards what the strengths of the students are. So if there are students who feel like their strength is writing poetry, then that's what they should do in order to help educate others about climate crisis. If students feel like they really have a strength in leadership and organization, well, then that's what they should focus on. How can they use their interests and skills in order to become climate heroes? The misconceptions here are addressed again throughout, but what I really want to emphasize here is that we feel it's really important to end on a message of hope, right? The next decade is ultimately what's going to define our climate future. And I know personally, when I think about the current state of climate action and policy, there are days when I feel hopeless. And that's not what we want students to take away as hopelessness. We want them to remember that every ounce of greenhouse gas that we do not put into the atmosphere or that we remove ultimately means a less extreme outcome, more lives saved, and more biodiversity maintained. This is the message that system change is possible, that we want students to walk away with. Again, really focusing on those skills that students feel that they can contribute to that. So with all of that said, Lynn would like to share with you some of the applets that I have mentioned. So I'm going to pass the baton back over to Lynn.
The first question I have is, did I mess up the screen? Can you still see the presentation?
We can.
Okay. I was opening up Anne's recommendation and I totally screwed everything up. I was like, oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't want to lose it though. So I was trying to make sure I snagged it. Anyway, so thank you, Cari. She did such a great job. We've been working on these lessons for 2 years and we are so very proud of them. And there is something in there for everyone. And I was sitting there analyzing each one, trying to think, where could we put in some nature journaling? Because Jack and I have been talking about that on the side, and I'm hoping he was doing the same thing. But I really do feel like for those of you who are teaching this in whatever situation you're in, because I know some of you do homeschooling, some of you are post-secondary, so whatever it might be, these are applicable across the spectrum. It's really just getting kids to understand that we are living in a very transitioning time and that we need to be prepared for it. And I think that avoiding discussing this with them is actually a disservice because they're the ones that are ultimately going to bear the brunt of the weight of these changes. So I wanted to just show you a few pieces that we developed, and we actually had these applets generated with a partnership through King Center. And it's another example of how we do try to incorporate art forms. And I consider graphics an art form. I hope that all of you do as well. But what to me is so beautiful about this is the simplicity. So when you're really trying to help students understand different aspects of climate, having visuals is very powerful, as we all know. Visual really changes the discussion and it makes it richer. And so one thing that they can do is there's all these ideas out there about what causes global change. And, you know, we've had people say, well, it's solar radiation, you know, it's the flare-ups in the sun and things like that. And so we use data sets. And so if you look into the about section, actually the reference section, you can see that where all of our resources come from are from NASA and NOAA and very reputable sources. And then they took this data and they put it into a graphical form that students can really engage with. And so we also have kids talk about, well, volcanoes are a major driver of climate. And what you can actually see is that more often than not, and this is featured in lesson 3, volcanoes have the opposite effect of heating, but actually a cooling effect, which kids are very surprised by that idea. They don't think about the aftermath of the volcano. They think about the heat of a volcano. And then you can show them aerosols. So we look at this as a success story. Here, aerosols were a major component of what was happening in the ozone layer for so many years. And now we've actually reversed the majority of the effects of aerosols by that. Then we can get into land use. So as they go through this and they look at all these different pieces, the fun piece is when you hit the fossil fuel and the greenhouse gases, you can really see that this is the only pattern that matches the data. And for kids, that is powerful. It's extremely useful to them to see that in action. And they can even manipulate the graph to have them all added on together. So we love having these visualizations for students that are at a level meant for students, not at a post-secondary research level. We've taken this data and we've turned it into something that's usable for students. The other one I wanted to really, I have so many fun ones, but the other piece I was going to just highlight is that a lot of people are intimidated by lesson set 2. And that's because when you talk climate modeling, that is an area where if you're not a climatologist and you're not really versed in earth science and atmospheric science and all of those things, teachers are very hesitant to even address, because one of the biggest misconceptions that's pervasive is that climate models are not accurate. And so what I love about this visualization tool is we trace back in time all the way to 1972 to what we consider to be the first really well-known climate model. And we show the data for that particular piece. And then we transition to, okay, here's Brecker. And then we go to Hansen. So we're moving through time. And what they're really seeing is that regardless of how the models have become more and more accurate, the trend line has stayed the same. So when we talk about are models reliable, you are looking at nuances in these changes. And we go all the way up to 2007. That's the most recent report that we can actually do hindcasting and forecasting on. The most recent report just came out this year, but you have to have data collect over time in order to develop the next model that we can put out. So once that's available, we'll add it. But what's really interesting about this, and I don't know if you were paying attention when I was switching it, if you look over here, there's this resolution. Right now you can see that it's none. And then you also see that we have all these icons over here, and each one of these icons stands for something. These are the tested parameters. So when Sawyer put his parameter out there, he tested for nothing except temperature. And then as you move through I'm going to jump to Hansen, you can see that, okay, well, we've added one parameter, ocean heat lagging. So this was a variable that was added as we learned more data. And still not a whole lot going on. That's different. But then when you finally jump into the IPCC reports, look that they've added in. Now they're adding non-equilibrium time dependence. They're adding greenhouse gases besides CO2. They're adding climate sensitivity, and they're adding full generation circulation models of ocean and land. And look at our resolution getting better. We're moving through those video game models, essentially, because you remember what it was like when you were playing Atari. I hope you all remember. If you're not, then I'm definitely showing my age. But playing Atari and Pong and all those other very simplistic games, and now you can actually play a game where you feel like you're literally in the game. We've come so far. And so if we jump to 2007, you can see that even though it's a very clear picture now, we're still adjusting. And then lastly, at the bottom, you'll notice that there's sliders. They can actually use modern estimates with the older models to see that if we incorporated the data we know now in the past models, how would it change them? And you saw me click on it. This is using the model of the time. So if I go back to Sawyer, which was 1972, and then I use modern estimates, you'll notice that the changes are not profound. So when you're really trying to drive home to kids that climate models have a high degree of accuracy, this can be a really valuable tool. And we have multiple tools like that. Okay, so The other thing I just wanted to bring up is, oh yeah, I should show that. Hang on one second. I'm going to jump ahead real quick. We also wanted to show a bigger version of our concept map because I put the link to Berkeley in there. This is one of our favorite tools. And you can see that we have students look at each of those different models and they'll build, sorry, my Southern slipped. They'll build their actual parameters into that model as they go through it. And it's really powerful to let them see this is what was there in 72. Here's what's there now. And they get to really build that model on their own and see those changes. Let me jump back real fast. I wanted you to know that even though we're here to talk about climate change, we also have developed an entire set like this for evolution and another one for just nature of science. We're moving to middle school next, and then we're going to move to elementary school last. So I have job security for about 10 years, and you guys are welcome to come check in at any time and offer up ideas because we are constantly seeking new ideas to make science relevant to our students. And with that, I will open it up for questions. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing too.
This is amazing. I'm blown away by the work that you're doing. There are all these different themes that I just wanted to ask you about and to pick up on. One thing, just sort of right off the bat, I thought it was really interesting the way that you are dealing with these misconceptions. The idea that if you kind of just present the misconception, this sticky misconception, that may actually be what people remember at the end of the day because it is just so, it may be sort of feel intuitive, or may even rhyme and just sort of, or be kind of sound folksy. And so you're careful and strategic about how you present that. So all the sort of things, ideas of the backfire effect, you're taking those into account in how you structure these lessons so we don't psychologically sabotage the lesson we're trying to learn. I was wondering if you might just say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, and I love that you said that in that way, because one of our most important pieces is that we're a no conflict approach, because we can find commonalities across any, and we mentioned in the chat that this has become commercialized and politicized in ways that no one was expecting, but it's not really surprising sometimes that you can politicize anything these days. But and to have someone from the UK here to put that perspective out there is really powerful. And so when we are looking at what we're doing, we have to be sure that we're making sure that if we lead with evidence and we talk evidence, we're keeping it away from that arena of debating, because we don't want debate brought into the story, because we're past the point of debate in the climate scientific community. And there are still curriculums out there that really do say, well, you can still analyze both sides of the issue. That gets us nowhere. So we really want to focus on this is what we know, not is this happening? And I think that really removes a lot of that political element, and it can help with those sticky misconceptions, because if you're not setting it up to be a discussion like that, where there are two sides, you eliminate a lot of that conflict.
Additionally, I'm sorry.
No, please.
We want to make sure that teachers feel set up for success, right? We know that they have enough on their plate already. We don't want to add to that any kind of controversy between them and their administrators or them and parents, right? We know that teachers are confident in discussing the evidence, confident in analyzing the evidence, and that's where we want to make sure that we're giving them that opportunity to continue doing that, as opposed to debate style. We know that they have enough on their plate. We don't want to add anything to that.
Yeah, the sort of the false balance that we kind of see sometimes, like in news reporting, scientists, after spending years trying to figure something out, they will get up, and we feel that sort of to have a sense of balance in the reporting on it, let's just get somebody up there who's going to disagree with whatever they say, and that's a non-starter. And this way is avoiding it. It also seems that this ties into your other curriculum on the nature of science in such an interesting way. I hear you kind of doing things on where we're really kind of metacognitively kind of understanding. It's not just saying like, here's a model, believe it, but you're kind of getting into what is modeling with something that we can know. You're understanding that and then letting the people come to their own conclusions by looking at the evidence that's there, rather than I'm going to tell you in a louder and more shrill voice than somebody else has told you something and hope that this pushes out what, because the ideas that are already stuck in somebody's brain, that is hard to move. It's already in there, hooked onto neurons. And sometimes it's hooked onto people's social circles as well. I was wondering what your thoughts were about how do you engage with a number of these things. It now hits us, it's not just been politicized, but that it is part of our social identity, gets wrapped up into what I believe about one idea or another. And that, so if I change my mind on this, I'm no longer really kind of a member in good standing of my primary identity group. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how we deal with that.
Well, I know that one that always comes to my mind right away is that I'm a farmer's daughter. I was raised in Tennessee by a dad who got up before the sun was up and stayed out until after the sun went down, combining and picking cotton and growing soybeans. And I watched my dad's crops change over that period of time of my youth. And I think that the important thing to remember is that you have to make it relevant to where you are. And farmers are actually very much aware of what's happening with climate. And they actually are moving into being one of the greater proponents for policy change, because it's our farmers that are being hit so heavily. So what I would try to say from that example is that you talk in a language that is relevant to your area, and you keep it on what we're seeing and not make it all grave and doom and gloom. It's really important to not engage in that kind of doomist. If you don't do this, and you also have to remember that people's livelihoods are tied to many of the careers that are being affected by the concerns about climate. And you have to really engage in ways that are relevant to how will we still be okay if we start transitioning through these jobs. And one really powerful example of that would be West Virginia, because West Virginia has been known as a coal mining industry for all of the past 100 to 200 years. And they just put up a huge wind farm. And in fact, they're looking to become more involved in green energy, and they're transitioning those coal jobs to green jobs. And if West Virginia, who we often have that kind of like stubborn mentality as if they're embracing that kind of change, I think that can be really powerful in that particular arena. And then Cari might have something to add on to that.
I really just want to circle back to what you said about meeting people where they are, right? So that means if you're in a community where people's identity is based in part on agriculture, then you're meeting people in agriculture. If you have a community in which people have a different kind of economic tie to climate change jobs, like Lynn suggested coal mining, but there's a variety out there. Finding ways to meet them where they are and show them that who they are as a person and who they are as a community is not dependent on what happens with our climate, but that what happens with our climate is part responsibility of everyone. That's what I really love about our climate change super solutions unit, is that the Project Drawdown really allows people to investigate different ways changing parts of our communities will impact climate. So allowing students to say, well, I'm not really willing to change this aspect of my community, but I am willing to change these other aspects of my community. One of the changes looks at dietary restrictions. So can we or should we put a kind of restriction on how much meat people are eating? And, there's whole groups of people who really love their Sunday barbecue, right? So trying to think of what are we willing to change and what are we not willing to change, and thinking about how we can still maintain other aspects of those identities.
And as a person who loves red meat, I can tell you that that's a very hard one for me. But I did read the study just last week that said if you cut out meat from one day of your week across the US, it could cut our emissions 25%, just one day a week. And that study just recently dropped, looking at that possibility.
Yeah, my little 9-year-old Carolyn has decided that she wants to turn our family as meatless as possible, and so she's now we started with 1 day a week, and now she's got us where a couple of days a week we'll have meat, and so she's a 9-year-old force of change. I'd love to open this up to questions from people in our nature journaling community. Before I do, I just wanted to one last comment of something that I just am so excited about, and I just love about what you're doing. Again, is that this is addressing concepts and ideas that are important for us to have a societal shift on. But more than that, at a level above that, this is about how we think about things and how you're looking at how do you analyze evidence for claims. You even had part of this, students were sort of defining their role as a scientist. And that if the more that we can kind of have an identity of that our identity is not based on an outcome or a specific claim, but our identity is based on the process that we use to come up with a claim. Then we're in a place where we can change our mind in the presence of evidence. And that is incredibly powerful. Everything from how you weren't just saying like, here's the model and you should believe what it says, but you're helping people understand what are models, what is, and what are pros and cons with that. And then get to play with them and tweak, and then they're drawing their own conclusions. This is about how do you think, not about what you should think. And this is beautiful.
I loved how you said that about drawing their own conclusions. And I also loved how you said that your daughter was the force in your house, because when we really look at what is at stake and what's going to happen in our futures, it's our kids that are actually driving our changes about thinking about climate. It's not going to be politics. It's not going to be a president. It's not going to be any of that. It's going to be our children. And look at how your child, 9 years old, has already influenced your home. That's where I really think the power in talking about climate with kids is so important. They really see it seriously. My 14-year-old loses sleep sometime, and I'm always trying to calm her down. She has anxiety. And so I'm always trying to calm her down. It's like, we can deal with these issues, and the kids need to hear that. Climate anxiety is actually now becoming a category in therapy circles.
So if you have a question or a comment or a thought that you want to share and be part of this conversation with our guests from the National Center for Science Education, you can use the raise hand function. You can also, I will be kind of monitoring the gallery. If that's not working on your device, you could just raise your hand like this, and I will probably see you. So feel free to do that. We're going to start with, we're going to jump up to Canada and join and Billy Joe.
Hey, sorry, my hand raise function is not here, which is really weird today. I just had a question. I'm super impressed to go through with this. And like Jack said, I live in Ontario, Canada. And so I'm just wondering if eventually, like some of the models and things like that you'll have, will you have international like equivalences that can kind of go with that. And in terms of that, I know it's a national, so I know you're based in the States, but I'm just wondering, because in Canada, like obviously we're close to you, so the models and stuff like that will probably be quite similar. But I would know that most of the kids would be like, but how does it affect us here? And what does that look like in terms of models? So I'm just curious if that's something that is on your extremely busy agenda.
Well, Billy Joe, I do like that you asked that question because the applets we developed were all developed with a group called King Center out of Edmonton, Alberta. And in fact, our third simulation that I didn't show because it's a little more complex and I wanted to make sure there was time for questions is called Design Your Climate. They have an entire curriculum set for their Canadian teachers inside that lesson. I'll put the link in just a second. I know she put it straight to the applets, but I'll put it to King Sitter in general.
Yeah.
They have a plethora of Canadian activities. And then I also work with a woman named Deb Morrison who teaches at the University of Washington, but is a Canadian herself.
Oh, okay.
She's been developing a lot of pieces for Canadians as well. And so while we know that that is something we need to do, it's not in our immediate 5-year plan.
Sure.
But we do try to make sure that our lessons have universality and that with a little bit of tinkering, they could adjust really well to the UK or Canada.
Yeah. I had a feeling there was something there because I seen a .ca, so I was like, wait a minute.
That's for sure.
Oh,
and
that's
I
amazing.
Adore that group.
Oh, that's awesome.
The last thing I was going to say was the biggest area we know that will need help is lesson 4, having that, because we talk about climate in your own backyard. Right now, they do all of the regions of the US.
Right.
And so that would be the one that would be the hardest to adapt right now.
Yeah, it would be, but we could probably look like directly north of you and sort of get like, something that's quite similar in terms of that.
There would be
some. Yeah, because Midwest, like that's our prairies, like, right? So it's sort of a similar, like even if we think about that and go through there. That's amazing. I will look in the chat for that link. Thank you so much. This has been a really amazing presentation. Awesome work.
Thank you.
So just delighted that you folks were able to come and join us here. If anyone else has questions for the National Center for Science Education, please do raise your hand. I was wondering what your thoughts were on sort of ways to spread the word about this. So if you've been inspired by this, I know one thing obviously we can do is talk to the teacher friends that you know. I know a lot of teachers are scared. They're scared to touch this. Any thoughts on how to reach out to teachers in our areas, or also what you folks would say to teachers who are feeling like, but there's a controversy, right?
Let Cari take that one.
We'll bring on maybe Cari, and then I'll bring in one of our co-hosts, Avea, who has a thought on that.
Yeah, we have teachers in our teacher ambassador program, but also in our curriculum field testing program, who've heard from their administrators that they just can't teach this, that it's not in the standards, which it's true. It's only addressed in some of the next generation climate standards and only at a high school and middle school level, and definitely not at an elementary school level. But I tend to think that some of our lesson sets are kind of sneaky about being about climate change, particularly about the extreme weather. If you're learning about weather at a middle school level, or weather at a high school level, or even weather at an elementary level, there's a lot there that you can then sort of add in. Well, what if temperatures were increasing? What if there was more energy in the ocean? And allow students to think about it on their own. What would happen? What would they see? I also think that it is important to let parents know what is going on in your classroom and how it applies to the standards in your area. And I would encourage anyone who feels like they're having some kind of problem with their administration or with parents to get in touch with us, because this is one of the things that we do, is help teachers and make sure that teachers feel secure in what they're teaching in their classroom. And we, have a variety of tools that we use to do that.
And to chase that really fast before we transition over, and I was so afraid to try to say your name, but Yavea?
Yavea.
Yavea.
Okay. I wanted to add that our website is not just our lessons. There is tons of material and resources for having these discussions available both on evolution and climate. And we have an NCSE Teach newsletter where I assemble together relevant pieces every month for teachers. You guys are more than welcome to join our NCSE Teach newsletter to keep abreast of those issues. But going back to your original comment about how do we make teachers feel more comfortable with the material, we are hoping to develop tutorials within the next year or so that actually will help teachers gain that confidence. They're not ready just yet because we just now finished the curriculum, but one of our, we call it our phase 4 plans, is to have little mini concept moments for teachers to reinforce their own learning. And we're actually going to have our own teachers do it. Like, it's not going to be us, it's going to be our teachers sharing what works for them for a particular concept that may be not a strength, something in earth science, like, convection currents. I had to relearn convection currents to help my child pass the 8th grade. So things like that. And so we're hoping to have that kind of grab bag for teachers coming in who need to have that assistance.
Excellent.
And so I pass it to you.
Y'all already began to answer my question. I was going to be asking about parents specifically and preparing them. And then you mentioned the NGSS, and that made me wonder, I'm not sure if this is a silly question, but would you say that the NGSS is widely accepted and used in most schools around the country, or are there still places that kind of resist NGSS?
7 states left that do not have either an NGSS framework or an NGSS accepted curriculum. So we've made progress. They introduced in 2013. And so we're down to 8 states technically, but Pennsylvania is joining the NGSS aligned group soon. So it'll be 7 after that. And I can name most of them, but if you put me on the spot, I won't be able to name all of them. But I can tell you for sure that Texas and Virginia and Mississippi and Georgia are on the list of those that are still independent science standards. But when we talk about NGSS, it has really penetrated the scientific education community.
And I just want to jump off of what Lynn just said about NGSS to say that one of the things that we do at NCSE is research how public school curricula are aligned to teaching climate change. So we do investigation to see who's quote unquote making the grade when it comes to teaching climate change in their classrooms. And that research is on our website.
Yeah, if you give me a second, I'll go grab it.
That's powerful. It's really useful. I'd like to, we're going to bounce over to the island of Hawaii.
I want to go.
And aloha, Kate. Oops, I just, let me try that one more time. I'm going to add Kate into our spotlight. And now, Kate, you can unmute. Aloha.
Aloha. Climate change is obviously very relevant and important to us here. We have houses literally falling into the ocean. So there isn't as much resistance. There is a lot of climate anxiety that I'm hearing from students. And so when you talked about your final module of students coming up with solutions, I just was wondering, and this is kind of to the whole group, are there any sort of organizations that help connect students with each other, like the ones that are, choosing to do programs or feeling like a leader, just because my daughter just got elected school president. And so one of her ideas was to make our school zero waste. And she's having a lot of challenges in like figuring out how to do that in our school. Like, you know, there's not a lot of support like within her school. Like, you know, obviously her parents and grandparents were all super supportive, but it would be great if she had other networks of support, just because she has a lot of questions that we don't know how to answer. And then to also know that she's not the only kid out there that really cares about climate and wants to do something. She's like, there's, you know, she has a poster for Greta Thunberg on her wall. But like knowing that there's other like local like kid activists who want to make change. Yeah, climate generation. Oh, awesome. Lots of links. Thank you, everybody. Because yeah, I really thought too, the module on like comparing climate right now, like just what's happening now and like those local things is so relevant to nature journaling, and something that I really think we could integrate in a lot of programs out here, just keeping track of our hurricane events, and because we just we're watching it as a state and being able to compare it to historical trends and stuff. So just thank you so much for the work you're doing, and I'm excited to look into it more. My cat also wants to be on stream.
I think that it's important that all species care about the climate. You have to be human.
I want to shout out an organization that I actually worked with when I was a teacher, called Schools for Climate Action, which might be something that your daughter is interested in. The students actually create a kind of climate action resolution to pass at their school, which they then take to their school board to have them sign as well. And then those resolutions go to Congress members and senators to alert them that this is something that, you know, our students want. Our students want climate action. And so this is maybe another opportunity for her to elevate more work.
What was the name of that organization again?
I've put the link in the chat, but it's called Schools for Climate Action, and it's actually run by a student out of California. So it's a student organized organization.
Okay.
Well, and I'm sure you know this, Kate, but in Hawaii is actually one of the most forward thinking about climate curriculum. And there are many bills going through your political system right now that are meant to actually address place-based responsiveness to climate change. And they're even making sure that the indigenous peoples of Hawaii are included in those bills and those things. And so the really good news is that your island is one of the most, I mean, like you're at the forefront of how we should be modeling the future of climate education. So take heart in that at least I know that it's because it's affecting you more, but it is also heartening that there are states that are actually not avoiding the topic.
Well, and I brought it up too, because I was thinking about how you're saying that there's a question of teachers who are really hesitant to teach this. And, you know, if kids from states who have this sort of strong foundation and this really relevance can talk to kids, you know, in other states that are, you know, maybe like they're feeling like they're the only ones who feel that way, and help support them and help get the movement so that it isn't just like this one lone teacher trying to teach climate change, you know, helping create change in that way too, and helping.
Very powerful too. And our kids' stories are the most powerful.
Yeah.
That's why Greta made such a splash. So I see Sarah has her hand up.
Excellent. Kate, thank you so much for joining us. And let's see. Sarah, let's bring you on. I'm going to add you into the spotlight. Thank you so much for being with us. You are live. There we go. I think you can.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you so much for this amazing session. It's just been mind-blowing the amount of work. Sorry, my cat is joining in now as well. Oh, sorry. Excuse me.
My dog is getting interested, so if he barks, I don't know why.
yeah, I'm just blown away by the amount of work you guys have done. So thought out and just absolutely amazing. So yeah, you can probably tell from my accent that I live in the UK. So I think there are some slightly different cultural differences. So here, I think there is maybe perhaps a lot more climate anxiety, especially amongst children. And I guess one of the things I worry about is just how to help support children that are learning, or anyone that is learning about climate change, with their mental health. I'm 34 and I've worked in mental health for a long time. I feel like I have a lot of resources at my fingertips of how to cope, and it still absolutely terrifies me. And I still really, really struggle to just cope with the thought of what could happen, not just to other species, but the human consequences of climate change. And I guess I'm speaking from a place of fear, so maybe that's not the best place to be speaking from, really. But yeah, just any thoughts really on how to help people cope when they're maybe changing their perspective or learning about something, because it's such a massive thing to comprehend, isn't it?
Yes. And to a lot of our students who are already dealing with so much anxiety about the status of the world today, adding climate to that is just one more part, right? It's one more thing. So thankfully, there are resources out there to help students. One I'm putting into the chat right now is just climatementalhealth.net, which has good resources there. There's also a book called A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety, which has some helpful resources as well. And then this is something that I heard about last week, actually, called All the Feelings Under the Sun. I'm not familiar with it, but it is meant to help students and children in general how to deal with climate change and their feelings about climate change. So I'm putting a few more resources into the chat, but those are what I would recommend looking into. And they come with a variety of sources.
Awesome. Thank you.
And
welcome.
Peter recommended a good one as well. Yeah, and I will tell you that this is a relatively new area. I would highly expect that as we still continue to see more and more displacement, more and more. I mean, look at New Mexico right now. They've never seen a fire like this, and it's really affecting homes and our children's lives. I mean, we actually ran an article about our Kentucky teachers who had to deal with the tornado right around the holidays. I don't know if you remember that there was a massive tornado that hit Kentucky and that area at Christmas. And that is extremely rare. And while tornadic activity is not as strongly correlated to climate, the frequency and the patterns of more and more tornadic activity, there is a sort of a trend we're seeing there. But to have a Kentucky tornado at Christmas was extremely difficult. And they actually wrote an article for us on the website about what it was like to try to teach during a climate crisis. And I think that's another thing that we're going to have toolkits for teachers. How do we continue teaching when, I mean, even in Andover, we've had 1,000 homes destroyed. We've got kids without housing right now, and we're worried about them being able to read and write. How do we work through that? And I think you're going to see more and more material available, but if you search for it, it is starting to show up. And I will tell you, as someone who works with the Council of State Science Supervisors, it is very much on their mind. How do we deal with these issues in school? So it is coming. It may just not be in place just this yet. So
I'm going to do one last shout out, which was a panel that I watched last week called Climate Emotions Matter, which was run by one of our friends, Don Haas. There's a YouTube link now in the chat with a recording of that panel discussion. So yeah, again, thank you for bringing this to the forefront, Sarah. It's really important.
I even wrote it down that we need to actually have a resource page for it. I think that you really bringing that up made that really impactful to me. So thank you.
And I just want to maybe add one other thing to the discussion I think that something that also does help students grapple with these sorts of things is the kind of an approach to thinking about these that isn't based on authority, that somebody said, and because I'm hearing all these different things, if I'm giving the students the tools to understand and the tools to make decisions, then they feel as they are going forward, taking action, that it's not like that they're standing on solid ground, and they understand the basis for that. So I think that to be able to understand the ideas as you presented them in this curriculum also puts students both in a better place to take action, informed action, but also as they do that to have a mindset that is more resilient, because it's based on a solid foundation. Sarah, that was a really insightful question. Thank you.
And I do want to mention one other thing. We are seeing innovation at rates we've never seen before. We are going to address this problem. It may not happen in the timeline we need it to. You know how they say that it has to get worse before it gets better. I do feel that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. I hope that by having this kind of curriculum and having other people out there doing this kind of work, and it's not just us, it's a huge network of people working. We cannot definitely take all the credit. There's so many organizations right now trying to spread these messages of hope. I think that's important, Sarah, for our kids, because if we do approach it with fear, it can be immobilizing. And so we have to really kind of figure out, we can't fix it all right away. There is no silver bullet, but there are so many different ways we can mitigate. And there's so many different avenues of innovation that are actually starting to step up for that. So I think that is your silver lining, I hope, that might make you smile a little, is that we are seeing that change occur.
And Sarah, you had, I'll allow you to unmute again here. I thought you were about to say something, but I cut you off. I apologize for that.
Oh, no, I was just thinking about, yeah, I can totally see how the skills that you guys are teaching about really examining evidence and drawing conclusions from that can be applicable. There's like a crossover there with a little bit of maybe more self-understanding and thinking about your reaction to situations. And I can see how that kind of like evidence-based understanding could be really, really supportive for somebody trying to navigate the world that they're going to be growing up in now. Yeah, I just want to say thank you so much. It's just been an absolutely brilliant session. Thank you for all the work that you're doing. Absolutely incredible.
I'm trying not to cry, so thank you. I'm the emotional one. Cari keeps me in check.
Well, I want to echo that too. Lynn and Cari, thank you so much. The work that you're doing is very, very difficult, but you both bring a skill set to the floor here that is, years of classroom experience and really deep thinking about this. I think that your approach is really deeply wise and needed and useful. I want to encourage people to share these resources widely, to investigate them yourselves. If you are homeschooling, investigate them and see what you can pull out of this to be a kind of relevant tool, or to support the teachers in your school, your local school, at doing this. If your local teachers are feeling a little bit shy of it, you may be able to come in also as to say, like, I really support doing this. And as you do these lessons, what if I came into the classroom with you, and I'm not an expert on this either, but I'm willing to kind of roll up my sleeves, do the background study, and kind of help those lessons be successful in your class. We can get these sorts of lessons. I'd love to see these broadly adopted. It's pedagogically, metacognitively, this is the time is now. Thank you folks so much for being here.
Thank you.
We're going to be letting our guests go. Again, this is your Nature Journal Educators Forum with our special guests from the National Center for Science Education. With deep gratitude and respect, we'll see you in nature.